Okay, so hello and good afternoon to everybody on this beautiful snowy day in Sedona. So this is session 2 of the course on Sephardic Jewry. I'm going to be doing the first half of the lecture today, and then Sheldon will be taking over and doing the remainder, just to give you some idea of how today is set up. So the last time we covered the history of Sephardic Jews. We started in Roman times. We went forward until 1492. There were Jews living there. Sometimes they were subject to persecution. Other times, under conditions of relative tolerance and freedom, the Jews thrived and blossomed into what is called the golden age of Sephardic Jewry. And today we're going to cover why it was considered the golden age. I'm going to highlight just a few of the most prominent figures and examples of their brilliance. The shifting borders that we talked about in the Iberian Peninsula of conquest and reconquest led to a mixing and remixing of populations. You had Christians living under Muslim rule, Muslims living under Christian rules, and of course, Jews living under both at different times. This led to a commingling of languages, customs, lifestyles, and foods among the different ethnic groups, which was why sometimes to our Ashkenazi ears, some of the Sephardic Jewry seems Arabic and not very Jewish. We're going to start by talking about poetry. Not something I read a lot of, but I'm going to do my best. And we're going to start with Arabic poetry because the foundations of Sephardic poetry came out of and were adapted from Arabic poetry. In pre-Islamic days, it's been claimed that Arabic Bedouin tribes would meet in Mecca and they would hold poetry competitions with the winning poems displayed on banners, which were hung in the main square. Arabic for Muslims is in some ways parallel to Hebrew for Jews. They are both considered sacred languages. Arabic poetry was an important means of artistic expression, instruction, and entertainment. There were poetry slams, different groups competing against each other for who could do the best poetry. Poetry was told orally, and it really functioned in pre-literate Arabic societies as a type of literature. Arabic poetry could be religious or secular in nature. The poems could evoke the power of God and the exaltation of a mystical experience. Still, other poems extolled very secular things like love or wine, and sometimes both. Sephardic Jews started to emulate these patterns. Remember, Arabic spread with Islam. It was the common language within the Islamic Empire. So Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and others used Arabic as their secular language. So Jews wrote scholarly works in Arabic at the beginning. And between the years of around 950 to 1150, the Jews living in Al-Andalus began to compose Jewish poetry in Hebrew. And these Hebrew poets themselves were often courtier rabbis. They were deeply immersed in Arabic life, and they often served as officers. They had elevated positions within the Muslim courts. So they started by using Arabic poetics to create uniquely Jewish secular and religious poetry. Andalusian Jews recognized that their ancient Hebrew language, which had for a long time been restricted to a religious and theological language, could also serve as a living language for poetry. And they realized in their society that it was very acceptable for a pious Jew to write secular poetry in Hebrew. So Jewish poets were free to write poems and songs about love in various forms of Hebrew. Many of the poems were meant to actually be sung and have been incorporated into the literature. One of the first poets, to give you an example of, is Solomon Gabriel. He lived from 1021 to 1069 in Malaga, which is all the way in the southern part on the coast, the Mediterranean coast of Spain. He was a Hebrew poet and philosopher, and he was educated both in Hebrew and in Arabic. And his most famous poem is called Kingdom's Crown. It's a very long poem. Many Jewish prayer books include this poem or excerpts from it for recitation on Yom Kippur. So I'm going to read you one of his poems. It's interesting, when you went to Malaga, and we were there in September, that the Spanish, who were very good at persecuting Jews and kicking them out, are now trying to rediscover the Jewish heritage. It's a very good source of tourism. So in Malaga, we have this beautiful statue, and there is a little Jewish center under construction adjacent to the Jewish quarter. So it's taken them 500 years to rediscover that maybe they made a mistake in kicking all the Jews out. Anyhow, but back to the poetry. So, Solomon, I look for you early, my rock and my refuge, offering you worship morning and night. Before your vastness, I come confused and afraid for you. See the thoughts of my heart. What could the heart and tongue compose, or spirit strength within me to suit you? But song soothes you, and so I'll give praise to your being as long as your breath in me moves. The next poet we're going to talk about is truly probably the most esteemed and revered of Sephardic poets.
Tzion, halois ish ali l'shloim asirayich, dorshei shloimeich ve'im yeser adorayich, miyom u'mizrach, u'mitzafoin v'seimon, ve'eis ech Elohim shivas shvusech, ani chinor l'shirayich. Zion, will you not ask after the welfare of your prisoners, who seek your peace and are the remnant of your flock, from west and east, from north and south? And when I dream of the return of your captives, I am a harp for your melodies. This is the opening of perhaps the most famous poem of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, or as he was known at the time in his Arabic name, Abu al-Hassan al-Lavi, the poet laureate of the Jewish people.
Another poem by Judah Halevi. "'Tis a fearful thing to love what death can touch. A fearful thing to love, to hope, to dream, to be. To be and oh to lose. A thing for fools, this and a holy thing to love. Your life has lived in me. Your laugh once lifted me. Your word was gift to me. To remember this brings painful joy. 'Tis a human thing, love, a holy thing, to love what death has touched." He is regarded as probably one of the greatest Jewish poets. He wrote more than 800 secular and religious poems, several hundred of which have been adopted into the liturgy. He was born in the city of Toledo, Spain. Originally trained in medicine, his poetic talents soon became apparent. While familiar with Arabic, he chose to write his poems in Hebrew, and he helped to restore Hebrew as a living language. And many of his poems, as I said, were composed to be sung. So his early topics were secular: wine, women, and song. He also had a particular philosophy, and this is going to be important because we're going to contrast this with another view from Maimonides. He felt that deductive human reason cannot replace the direct experience of God through faith. He said, "I understand the difference between the God and the Lord, and I see how great is the difference between the God of Abraham and the God of Aristotle." He believed that the Jewish nation had a special place in God's plan for the redemption of the world. This is another poem that you may very well be quite familiar with. "On Friday doth my cup o'erflow. What blissful rest the night shall know, when in thine arms my toil and woe are all forgot. Sabbath, my love, till dusk with sudden light, distilled from one sweet face, the world is filled. The tumult of my heart is stilled, for thou art come, Sabbath, my love. Bring fruits and wine, and sing a gladsome lay. Come in peace, O restful Sabbath day." He also wrote a famous book in prose. And in the middle or the latter part of his life, Yehuda Halevi, the poet laureate of the Jewish people, broke with his past. He renounced his own Arabicized poetry and the Andalusian culture that he had lived in his entire life. He wrote a book called the Kusari. You remember Khazaria? You remember we talked about in the last lecture the possibility that there was this Jewish civilization north of Constantinople, the Khazars. So he wrote a book called the Kusari, and in it, he doesn't base it on fact, but the Khazarian king is trying to determine which is the truest religion. And he invites a Muslim imam, a priest, and a rabbi. And of course, the king is won over by the rabbi's arguments. The rabbi demonstrates the superiority of Judaism by bringing clear proof to the biblical account of getting the Torah at Sinai. So Halevi bases his arguments on history, tradition, and common sense. And he states in his introduction that the purpose of his work is to repel the attacks of those who would denigrate Judaism. So he holds that the wisdom of Greek philosophers lacked the divine support that the Israeli prophets were endowed with. So you get to God through faith. As I said, he was one of the most famous poets. He was a revered member of the Jewish community. Yet in 1140, at the age of 64, Judah Halevi, he leaves. We mentioned that the Muslims who had ruled the Umayyads were replaced by these more radical, more restrictive Muslims, the Almoravids. And it convinced Halevi that Jews belong in Israel. And his poetry reflected this longing to be in Zion. Halevi gets on a boat and he sails off into exile, intent on reaching Jerusalem. He gets as far as the Jewish community in Alexandria, Egypt, where, because of who he is treated like royalty. He stays for a while, and then he leaves. He never reaches Jerusalem. We don't know what became of Judah Halevi. He disappears, his fate is unknown, and that is how the poet laureate of the Jewish people ends his life whenever and wherever. So a final poem by Halevi. My heart is in the east, and I am in the west, as far in the west as west can be. Remember, he is in the Iberian Peninsula. It is a long way from Zion. How can I enjoy my food? What flavor can it have for me? How can I fulfill my vows or do the things I have sworn to do while Zion is in Christian lands and I am trapped in Arab lands? Easily, I could leave behind the Spain and all her luxuries. As easy to leave as dear the sight of the temple's rubble would be to me. Is this a Jew? He was the Grand Vizier to the King of Granada. He commanded an army 2 years before his army conquered the kingdom of Almeria. And he had just conquered the important city of Seville. And in 1041, he won his third major battle and he conquered the kingdom of Yadira. So this vizier general, riding back from the battlefield and his success, turned to write poetry to his psalms to thank his God for his victories. He wrote them in Hebrew, a poem. My friend, for me, in my straits, the rock rose up. Therefore, I offer these praises, my poem to the Lord. He recognized the fear of Yadir in my heart and erased it. So my song is sung to the healer. He ravaged my enemies with pain, easing my own. Someone objected, who are you to pay homage? I am, I answered, the David of my age. So who is this priest general who led his men to victories and then writes poems in Hebrew to God? He is Samuel Ibn Nagira. Samuel Hanigi.
There's so much richness here, and we're hearing the poetry in English. I do have to say that the poem we heard from Judah Halevi was said in a very Ashkenazic accent.
Yes.
And I would love to hear it the way my husband or someone who grew up in the more Arabic speaking culture would read it. So you just have to know that what you heard was very, what we call yeshivish. It was a very Ashkenazi kind of a sound. Also, I was interested because when I studied Judah Halevi, I was told that he died in Jerusalem in 1141. So is it possible that he did get to the Holy Land? That I hadn't heard that he didn't get there. I always felt that he happily did arrive before his death.
I think that's what we'd like to believe, but based on what I read, he left Egypt for the Holy Land, but I didn't find any evidence that he actually made it.
I see. Well, he does beautifully say, my heart is in the West and my soul and heart are with the East in Jerusalem, but here I am in the West. And that yearning for a sort of dual citizenship is something that has played out throughout the years. So that was beautiful that you shared it. And thank you for that.
You're welcome. So back to Samuel Shmuel Hanegi. So he was originally from Cordoba, and he was a master calligrapher and an excellent writer of dispatches and poems, who ultimately came to the attention of the king. And as I said, he became vizier, and he held that position for 30 years. He was a gifted Talmudic scholar. He rapidly rose to prominence. At the age of 34, he was appointed Nagid of the community. He put his newfound wealth and high authority to good use. He was passionate about disseminating knowledge. He purchased and gave away thousands of copies of books, presenting them to poor Jewish students in Egypt, Sicily, Spain, and Jerusalem. Remember, at a time when books were written by hand, so they were hard to come by and expensive. He actively sought to spread Judaism and Jewish culture, and he donated funds to those less fortunate who wished to study the Torah and the Talmud. He was one of the founding fathers of the new Hebrew poetry in the Golden Age. He dies in 1056. He's succeeded by his son, Jehoshaphat, who was not as well regarded and not as well liked by the surrounding Muslim princes. Sheldon will go into this in more detail, but there was a terrible anti-Jewish riot in Granada in 1066 when Jehoshaphat and most of the Jewish community was unfortunately murdered. As I said a little bit earlier, we are going to hear two visions of Judaism, Judaic faith. Judah Halevi, who believed in poetic faith, and Moses Maimonides, who believed in ethical rationalism. And the question, which I guess is still very much debated, and I will certainly defer to the rabbi, is whether faith and reason can be held simultaneously, or are they inherently contradictory? The bedrock of Andalusian Jewish culture had allowed that the premise was that genuine Jewish culture and devout faith in Judaism were not incompatible with Greco-Islamic philosophy. That Arabized Hebrew poetry did not diminish the Jewishness of the Jewish community. Which brings us to spending a couple of minutes talking about Moses ben Maimonides, commonly known as Maimonides, also as Rambam. He was a medieval Sephardic Jewish philosopher who became one of the most prolific and influential Torah scholars of the Middle Ages. He was an astronomer. He was a physician, the personal physician, the Saladin. He was born in Cordoba on Passover Eve in 1138 to an eminent Jewish family. He worked as a rabbi, a physician, and philosopher in Spain, in Morocco, and in Egypt. On his tomb in Israel, which is located on the western shore in the Sea of Galilee, is written, "From Moses to Moses, there has never been another Moses." So who was he? Why is he still so revered? Why are there so many Maimonides hospitals and other places who are named after him? He came, as I said, from a prominent Jewish family in the city of Cordoba that could trace their ancestry far back as part of the Davidic line. At an early age, Maimonides developed an interest in sciences and philosophy. He read those Greek philosophers that were accessible in Arabic translations, and he was deeply immersed in the sciences and the learning of Islamic culture. He was born during a time of relative tolerance, but the situation changed around the age of 10 when the more stricter Islamics, the Almoravids, came in to the Iberian Peninsula. Their slogan was "No synagogues, no churches." Faced with the choice of conversion or death, his family fled to Morocco, eventually settling in Cairo. Maimonides essentially believed that faith and reason are not enemies, but in Maimonides' thought, essential to each other if we are to understand God.
By the 12th century, after a period of relative harmony under Muslim rule, the Jews of Spain once again faced terrible persecution. Nevertheless, Sephardic Jews produced one of the greatest Jewish scholars of all time. Today, he is almost universally revered, but in his time, great controversy surrounded the one who would come to be known as Rambam. When Muslim rule arrived to Spain in 755, the Jews welcomed liberation from a hostile Christian society. While far from perfect, life under Islam as dhimmi, second-class citizens, was generally better than it had been under Christian rule. By the 12th century, Jews had joined the greater society as doctors, financiers, diplomats, and poets. In their own communities, Jewish writings and scholarship flourished. In 1138, amidst this flourishing, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, commonly known as Maimonides, or by the acronym Rambam, was born. He was raised in a prosperous, educated Jewish family. At an early age, Rambam was taught by Torah masters and soared through his studies. He even began to teach others and formed a strong bond with his first student, his younger brother, David. Sadly, in 1148, when Rambam was 10 years old, everything changed. The Almohad, a North African Muslim empire, conquered Cordoba, forcing Jewish families to choose conversion, expulsion, or death. So his family moved several times, first around southern Spain, then to Morocco when he was 24, until they eventually landed in Egypt in 1168. For a brief period, life seemed to settle down until Rambam's brother David, on a routine expedition to India in search of wealth, died, lost at sea. When Rambam heard the news, he became physically ill and could not leave his bed for an entire year. In a letter, he wrote, "The greatest misfortune that has befallen me during my entire life, worse than anything else, was the demise of the saint. And how should I console myself? He grew up on my knees. He was my brother. He was my student." And as if grief wasn't enough, Rambam and his family had come to rely heavily on his younger brother for financial support, and they now had no income. Though the Rambam's rabbinical scholarship had grown, the rabbinate of the time was considered a public service, and Rambam did not wish to receive financial support from the community. So, Rambam did what any reasonable Jew would do. He became a doctor. As a practicing physician, Rambam wrote medical theories chronicling contemporary conditions like asthma, diabetes, hepatitis, and pneumonia. He even stated the importance of eating in moderation, living an active lifestyle, and balancing mental health. But it's Rambam's contributions to religion that were even more remarkable. Following in the footsteps of Saadia Gaon, Rambam was a voracious reader whose unique mind plumbed the depths of Jewish theology alongside Islamic and Greek philosophy. Rambam's groundbreaking work, the Mishnah Torah, was an all-inclusive guide to the complex system of Jewish law. Even now, 800 years later, Rambam's reorganization of the Talmud's 2,711 dense pages of Jewish thought into 14 thematically arranged sections in the Mishnah Torah is still unmatched in breadth and lucidity. But the Mishnah Torah didn't persuade everyone to follow Rambam's teachings. Several critics complained that he didn't cite his sources. Some were upset that Rambam reordered topics in the Talmud, and others were concerned over Rambam's lack of transparency in arriving at his final conclusions. In a letter to his student Rabbi Yosef ben Harav Yehuda, he wrote of his Mishnah Torah, "In future generations, when jealousy and the lust for power will disappear, all of Israel will subsist on it alone, and will abandon all else besides it without a doubt." Rambam complained often of his critics, how they robbed him of his peace and the ability to devote himself to his Torah study. Another of Rambam's theological works, The Guide for the Perplexed, reconciled Jewish theology with Aristotelian philosophy. It was even banned in some rabbinic circles. Some dissenters felt that Rambam's work more closely resembled the words of Aristotle than those of Moses. But none of the criticism deterred Rambam from writing 7 Judaic and philosophical works, over a dozen medical works, and his treatise on logic. Some scholars claim that Rambam's incessant work ethic finally led to his untimely death in 1204 at the age of 66.
Now, for those of you who took the Rabbi and Paul's course should recognize this gentleman. He's going to explain a little bit, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, as to why Maimonides is considered controversial as well as being revered.
Maimonides was a controversial figure in Jewish history because he combined two things that nobody had quite combined with such prowess before. On the one hand, he was an ish halacha. He was the greatest rabbi of the Middle Ages. He wrote the greatest law code in all of Jewish history, the Mishnah Torah. He was an absolutely outstanding master halachist and a commentator on the Talmud and everything else. At the same time, he also mastered what we call chokhmah, which is the universal wisdom of humankind, which we have in virtue of the fact that at the beginning of history, God made us each in his image, which Rashi defines as lahavinu lahaskil. God gave us the power to understand and discern. And that translated itself into two fundamental disciplines in Maimonides' day, and still to some extent today, namely philosophy and science. And Maimonides was an absolute master at both these things, at both science and philosophy. So his first published work was on how to calculate the calendar, was on astronomy. His second published work was Milota Higaion, a treatise on logic. He knew the works of Aristotle and Plato and the Islamic interpreters and so on. Now, Jews knew you could be one thing or another thing, but somebody who was both at the same time was quite perplexing to them. And occasionally it would spill over into the kind of things Maimonides did. So, for instance, if you look at the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law written by Joseph Caro in the 16th century, it begins, Aruch Chaim, chapter 1, paragraph 1, about getting up in the morning. That's the Jewish way, begin in the beginning, getting up in the morning. The Rambam begins the Mishnah Torah not with getting up in the morning, but with the existence of God. In other words, Maimonides brought to bear the logical imagination, whereas Joseph Caro brought to bear the chronological imagination, where time begins, not where logic begins.
Rabbi, any comments?
Yes, Maimonides really spoke to the idea of philosophy and logic, and that's why he wrote the Guide to the Perplexed. He knew people had doubts, and he answered those with why one should have faith and how we could have faith. And beautifully said there about he knew all the different aspects, and he tried to summarize it sort of bottom line. This is the halacha, this is what we do, and less about the chronological. Very well said. By the way, I did look up again, I went deeper, and you're right. It's a legend that Halevi got to Israel. They wanted that to be true, but in fact, they do not know, but they did name a street after him.
Thank you. So we talked about the golden age in terms of philosophy and poetry. We're going to briefly touch on architecture. Obviously, Sephardic architecture was heavily based off Spain's Moorish designs because that is the communities that they lived in. Unfortunately, after the Spanish Inquisition, there are not many Moorish-style synagogues left to visit in Spain. Two of the most famous that are still standing that can be visited are in Toledo. And I'm going to show you what they look like.
In Spain, Toledo was one of the most important Jewish communities. 1,000 years ago, under Muslim rule, the Jewish community thrived here. But then after the Christians took over, their circumstances began to change. And 500 years ago, Jews were expelled from Spain altogether. 2 synagogues remain from that time period, and we know where the old Jewish quarter was. Some of the houses are there, the streets. The Ibn Shushan synagogue was built in 1180 and is perhaps the oldest existing synagogue in Europe. Today is one of the few reminders of the Jewish presence in Toledo, and standing in the building, one is moved by the beauty of its columns. It is not the same as it must have been. Toward the front, where the Ark and the Torah were once located, we do see a Christian cross and other indications of Christian presence. The Jewish quarter of Toledo was attacked in the anti-Semitic riots of 1391, essentially destroying this vibrant community. Later, the firebrand evangelist Vicente Ferrer entered the Jewish quarter under armed guard and confiscated the Ibn Shushan synagogue in the name of the church. Its name was changed to Santa Maria la Blanca. Just down the street is the Sephardi Museum, which is located in the other surviving synagogue. Samuel Halevi Abulafia, the treasurer of the king, built this synagogue in 1357, known today as El Tránsito. The ceiling has decorative patterns of inlaid ivory, and under the windows, atop the towering walls, long lines of psalms are written in Hebrew script. The Ark for the Torah has been preserved, as well as the richly carved plasterwork on the eastern wall. Every surface is ornately beautified. Along the south wall, we see the women's balcony, which would have been covered with latticework to isolate women from the gaze of men. Women could observe the liturgy, but they could not participate. In a patio outside of the building, lapidaries that once covered Jewish graves lie in the sun, bereft of the ones they were supposed to protect, but giving us some insight into the Jews who once lived here.
I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm probably going to skip a little bit over the Alhambra, but I'm going to show you a little bit. It is the most famous palace, if you will, and it is truly magnificent. It was started perhaps by Jews, but it really isn't a Jewish structure. The Moors built on top of and expanded the fortress, but it's worth taking a look at.
Its dominant site is the Alhambra, the last and greatest Moorish palace. Nowhere else does the splendor of that civilization, Al-Andalus, shine so brightly. For 2 centuries, until 1492, Granada reigned as the capital of a dwindling Moorish empire. As Christian forces pushed the Moors further and further south, this palace was the last hurrah of a sophisticated civilization. While the rest of Europe slumbered through much of the Middle Ages, the Moorish civilization was wide awake. The math necessary to construct this palace would have dazzled Europeans of that age. The Moors made great gains in engineering, medicine, even classical Greek studies. In fact, some of the great thinking of ancient Greece had been forgotten by Europe, but was absorbed into Islam and actually given back to Europe via scholars here in Spain. The culture of the Moors was exquisite, artfully combining both design and aesthetics. Facing a reflecting pond, the Hall of the Ambassadors was the throne room. It was here that the Sultan, seated Oz-like, received foreign emissaries. Its wooden ceiling illustrates a command of geometry. With 8,000 pieces, inlaid like a giant jigsaw puzzle, it symbolizes the complexity of Allah's infinite universe. Arabic calligraphy, mostly poems and verses of praise from the Quran, is everywhere. Muslims avoid making images of living creatures. That's God's work. But decorating with religious messages is fine. One phrase, "Only God is victorious," is repeated 9,000 times throughout the Alhambra. Like the Sultan, we can escape from the palace into what was the most perfect Arabian garden in Andalusia. This royal summer retreat, lush and bursting with water, was the closest thing on earth to the Quran's description of heaven. In fact, its name, the Generalife, meant essentially that.
It's a very beautiful, something truly worth seeing. This is a reflecting pond, one of the fountains. I wanted to sort of close by talking about some other prominent Sephardic Jews who've had a lasting impact. Sir Moses Montefiore, for instance, was born into a Sephardic household of Italian Jews. He was raised and he remained a devout Jew his whole life. He rose to prominence as a successful businessman. He was dedicated to helping his fellow Jews and supporting Jewish communities and institutions in the Holy Land. He personally visited Israel 7 times, the last time at the age of 91. So he was very important in sort of reviving a Jewish presence in the Holy Land. He served as sheriff of London. We don't think of Jews as a sheriff. I don't know if they gave him a gun or in 1837. He was knighted by Queen Victoria. And he traveled throughout the world, especially Eastern Europe, to Russia, Romania, Morocco, to try to help prevent the persecution of Jews. So Sir Moses Montefiore, who is this? The rabbi will know. And if you've taken one of her classes, you know. He claimed he was only copying from someone else's book. Although he was a respected member of the Jewish community in Castile, he became sort of a peddler, traveling around selling pamphlets based on teachings that he claimed was written by Rabbi Simeon ben Yohai in the 2nd century. And this book forms the cornerstone of Jewish mysticism called the Kabbalah. Who is this? Moses of Leon. And the book is the Zohar. And I know the rabbi has taught classes on Kabbalah. Like Halevi, Moses felt that the philosophical vision of the universe was sterile, and one could not reach the ultimate revelation just on philosophy. He also felt that traditional Jewish learning failed, so he turned to Kabbalah, or Jewish mysticism. And the Zohar is written mostly in Aramaic, which, as you know, so is the Talmud. And again, it's beyond the subject of this lecture, but a lot of Jewish mysticism comes from a Sephardic Jew, Moses of Leon. The fellow in the gold cape, that is the only existing image of Christopher Columbus. So that's Christopher Columbus. It's the only painting or image that we have. Why do we care? Because Louis de Torres, okay, who was Columbus's interpreter, was Jewish. He had to convert the day before the boat sailed, because this was the days of the Inquisition, and he couldn't survive without becoming a converso. And it's interesting that Columbus sailed the day before the Edict of Expulsion took place. And Columbus believed he would meet up with Hebrew-speaking Jews on reaching India. He thought he would find the lost tribes. So it's possible that the first words a European spoke to Native Americans was in Hebrew. Think about that. Thomas de Torquemada. Now we have to have the booze. Sheldon will go over this. He was the Grand Inquisitor. But you know what? He came from a family of conversos. The families converted from Judaism to Christianity in the 1300s. The good and the bad. Obviously, this was well hidden. And I'd like to close my part with this. Just some of the Sephardic Jews who've won Nobel Prizes. 0.5% of the world's population, roughly 20% of the Nobel Prizes have gone to Jews. Thank you. I hope you found that interesting. I hope you can appreciate the heights that Jewry in Sepharad attained. And at this point, I'm going to stop my screen sharing and turn the program over to Sheldon. Sheldon, it's all yours.
Let's give you some some thank yous. That was beautiful.
You're welcome.
So much richness there. Such a culture, and in so many different lands, because many of those who fled from Spain actually went to the Ottoman Empire. It was what they knew. So they went to Iraq and Morocco and many places in Northern Africa and near Baghdad, and joined with the original Mizrahi communities that were there. Just beautiful. Of course, some went to Rome and to Bulgaria, and we have some congregants actually who came through that way. B.
There's some question about the sailors on Christopher Columbus ships, because the first synagogues were in the islands that were discovered in those voyages.
I think Sheldon's going to get into that as
Okay,
part of his
good.
talks. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Richard.
Linda?
I just, a comment. Thank you so much. It helps me realize why when I was in Spain in 1971, going to the synagogue there that still existed was so emotional. And everything that I saw there, including the Alhambra, still brings back memories. And also, I have to say, my confirmation essay was on Maimonides, and I wish I still had it.
All right. Well, I want to thank Richard. Richard has shown us the high points of Sephardic Jewry's experience in Spain. And now I begin to document the community's decline and eventual expulsion. For Sephardic Jewry living in Spain in the 8th through 10th century, this was a golden age. There were advancements in literature, poetry, music, art, science, medicine, architecture, astronomy, agriculture, and languages. Jews prospered socially and financially and were able to find a balance between the secular world and their religious faith. The Spanish have a word for this period, la convivencia. The concept of convivencia means coexistence and refers to the time when Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived together for 700 years in medieval Iberia. Next slide, please, Jenny. This is a medieval illustrated manuscript of a Jew on the left and a Muslim on the right playing chess together, which represents that special time of coexistence. Slide off, please. But was this convivencia really a golden age for Jews? The concept of a golden age has less to do with Jews in medieval Spain and more to do with politics in 19th century Germany. Here's a video of Dr. Henry Abramson discussing this question. Dr. Abramson has a large number of YouTube videos on many Jewish topics.
Again. So Jews in Germany were trying very hard to make the case that they should be emancipated as well, granted equal rights, equal access to colleges and universities, equal access to professions and things like that. And one of the things that was part of their overall intellectual strategy was look at Spain from the 10th to the 12th centuries. Look at what happens when a society gives its Jews more freedom. Those Jews suddenly are able to make phenomenal contributions back to the society. They're able to express themselves culturally. They're able to express themselves in literature, in science, in diplomacy, in military arts, all kinds of areas where, Jews are this untapped human resource that are going to waste because of these artificial political disabilities that are placed on them. So by sort of elevating the Spanish Golden Age and this noble Sephardic ideal, the 19th century historians really tried to create an image of this perfect society as a model for 19th century Germany to follow. The historical reality has a lot to say in support of that model, but as I've tried to outline here, there are some major caveats that take away from it. But at
So
any
during
rate,
this period, there were always limits to Jewish authority and Jewish attainment. Jews were always subservient to their Muslim or Christian rulers. Jews were always second-class citizens. Jews in general did better under Islam than under Christianity. And the Muslim Pact of Umar gave Jews a protective status. Next video, please.
In the 7th century, Islamic armies began conquering lands across the Middle East, North Africa, and Southern Europe. As the caliphate spread, Muslim leaders faced questions on what to do with non-Muslims who would not submit to conversion living within their new borders. They eventually settled on the Pact of Umar, which declared Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians dhimmis, or people of the pact. This status allowed Jews significant autonomy and protection, but demanded a special tax called the jizya and established rules that made Jews and other dhimmis second-class citizens. In times of economic prosperity, these rules were often relaxed or ignored, but they ensured Jews remained second-class citizens throughout the Muslim world. Despite the challenges of the dhimmi status, such restrictions were preferable to the massacres and forced conversions that Jews faced in Europe.
The Pact of Umar regulated Jews' occupations and clothing, but Jews preferred Muslim society because it was governed by law, as opposed to Christian mob violence. Let's see how Jews were treated in Muslim lands and in Christian lands.
Bernard Lewis, very important 20th century historian who looked at this period, he says, in a very moderate way, he says, look, Jews in Muslim lands, quote, were never free from discrimination, but were only rarely subject to persecution. This is, I think, a fairly temperate way to characterize several centuries of Jewish experience in Muslim lands. And when you compare it, pound for pound, incident for incident, there's no question that the moments of violence that punctuated Jewish-Muslim relationships was nothing compared to the same thing we would find in Christian Europe, as we shall explore over the course of this semester. He also said, and this is also a helpful kind of way of thinking about the period, it was never as bad in Muslim lands as it was in Christendom when Christendom was at its worst, nor, on the other hand, was it ever as good for Jews in Muslim lands as it was in Christendom when it was at its best. And I think that's a fairly moderate and even-toned way to characterize these centuries. In other words, in Muslim lands, as the British historian Martin Gilbert put it, there was no Inquisition, there was no Holocaust, but at the same time, Jews never achieved the same level of full legal emancipation and broad acceptance that they would, for example, in England or in France. So this is kind of like a broad way to compare the experience of the Jews under the crescent, that is in Muslim lands, and under the cross, that is in Christian lands.
Both Jews and Muslims were treated poorly by the Visigoths. In the 8th century, Jews looked upon the Muslim invaders from North Africa as their saviors from the terror of Visigothic Spain. This is the extent of Muslim Spain in the 8th century. The green section, which covers almost the entire peninsula, is Muslim. Only the northern top is Christian. For the first 200 years, Jews helped administer Muslim lands. The current anger in the 21st century Middle East between Jews and Muslims obscures their great friendship, which existed from the 8th through the 15th centuries. In the 11th century, the golden age for Jews in Spain declined with the arrival, as Richard said, of a new, harsh, fundamentalist Muslim invader from North Africa. In the mid-12th century, dhimmi status, which protected the Jews, was abolished, and Jews were offered the choice of conversion to Islam, death, or exile, and many Jews chose conversion to Islam. It was in response to this Islamic persecution in 12th century Spain that the family of Moses Maimonides chose exile and left Spain for Egypt, where Maimonides did most of his work. Now let's look at Christian persecution of Jews in the Middle Ages. The expulsion of Jews from Spain was an enormous blow to world Jewry because of the sheer number of Jews involved and because of their high level of achievement. But this pattern of Jewish persecution followed by expulsion, was well established hundreds of years before the Spanish expulsion in 1492. In 1492, two medieval Christian practices converged: Christian expulsion of Jews and Christian anti-Semitism. The word anti-Semitism was invented in the 19th century Germany, so I will use the age-old word Jew hatred. Let's look at Jewish expulsions. Next video.
The end of the European Middle Ages is that the Jews are successively expelled from most Western European lands. They're expelled from England in 1290, France beginning in 1306, Spain and Sicily in 1492, Portugal in 1497, the Kingdom of Naples, the southern half of Italy, in 1541, which means by the end of the European Middle Ages, except for parts of Germany and northern Italy, Western Christian Europe is essentially Judenrein. It is essentially free, pure of Jews.
Expulsions were meant to separate Jews from Christians, to degrade them and make them convert to Christianity. This was overwhelmingly a Christian practice. It was driven by Jew hatred and was abetted by the financial needs of the rulers. Whenever rulers owed too much money to the Jews, it was convenient to simply expel the Jews and confiscate their property and debts. Then, after a few years, Jews would pay a ransom to return to the area. And a few years later, the pattern would repeat and Jews were expelled again. The expulsion from England in 1290 involved only about 3,000 Jews. Contrast this with approximately 200,000 Jews expelled from Spain in 1492, and we get an idea of the magnitude of this tragedy. The medieval period saw increasing Jew hatred, along with accusations of blood libel, poisoning of wells, desecrating the host, anger at Jewish money lending, anti-Talmudism, and increasing hatred by the church. Now, why did the church hate Jews so much more than Muslims did?
History in the next
video, please.
The first is we should understand that the nature of anti-Jewish antipathy in Christian lands is of a highly distinct character when compared to that in Muslim lands. Recall that Christianity is born from Judaism directly, that there is that special mother-daughter relationship which can have an unusual level of acrimony, particularly when the daughter religion tries to articulate how it is different than the mother religion. And we saw a lot of that, for example, when we looked at the work of the Church Fathers. Islam is kind of like a granddaughter religion. It occurs 6 centuries later, and it doesn't necessarily have the same kind of need to distance itself from Judaism that Christianity did. It's a very
So just as Muslims use the Pact of Umar to keep their Jews subservient, the church used the doctrine of witness to keep their Jews subservient. In the 4th century, St. Augustine formulated the doctrine of witness. It said that although Christianity superseded Judaism as the true religion, God wants the Jews to continue to exist so they can bear witness to the second coming of Christ. Christian rulers had to protect the Jewish people so they could bear witness to the truth of Christian doctrine. So Christians can make Jews subservient and enslaved, but the church cannot kill them. The first Catholic rulers of Spain, the Visigoths, created crypto-Jews. The Visigoths initially went by old Roman law, and Jews were not treated badly by Rome. But in 589, the Visigoths became Catholic, and the situation changed dramatically. After conversion to Catholicism, the Visigoths began persecuting Jews, and their laws were similar to the laws of the future Inquisition. Nazi philosophy can be traced back to the Inquisition, which can then be traced back to the Visigoth period after they converted to Catholicism.
And following this, aggressive anti-Jewish measures were taken. Most infamously, a quarter century later in 613, his successor, King Sisebut, ordered the conversion or expulsion en masse of all Jewish communities living in the Visigothic kingdom. And it's estimated that even in the early 7th century, this ultimatum affected as many as 90,000 Jews who either submitted to baptism, becoming nominal Catholics, or they fled abroad, primarily to France or North Africa. And by the mid-7th century, the famous law code of the Visigoths, known as the Lex Visigothrum, was promulgated. And while in the legal literature it's revered as one of the most able codes of law that has come down to us, the stamp of its anti-Jewish animus is readily apparent. It tells us, quote, "We lament that the soil of our kingdom is still defiled by the infamy of the Jews." So accordingly, in a refrain that was neither the first nor the last time in history, key rituals were forbidden to be practiced. Jews could not practice kashrut, the dietary laws, circumcision, the Brit Milah, or observe the Shabbat. But the most significant clause of this code, which would have far-reaching consequences for Jewish, Christian, and Iberian history, is that it tells us, quote, "Jews, whether baptized or not, are forbidden to testify in court." And so this effectively created what some scholars have called the racialization of religion, whereby Judaism at this time ceased to be viewed as a matter of faith by the outside society and came to be viewed as something innately biological, something transmitted by blood or by race. And so the forcible conversions of the tens of thousands of Jews during the reign of Sizebut created an entirely new category of persons who were nominally Christians, but were secretly practicing or maintaining Jewish rites and rituals. And they came to be known as New Christians, as Cristianos Nuevos in Spain or Cristãos Novos in Portugal. Effectively synonymous terms for these people and their descendants would be Marranos, Anusim, Conversos, or crypto-Jews. And significantly, as we see here, the very phenomenon of crypto-Judaism, which would come to greatly haunt, so to speak, Iberian history, was born in the mid-7th century. And 7 centuries later, the Inquisition would be created to definitively deal with it.
So these Visigothic laws created precedent for the future. And in their zeal for a uniform Christian state, the Visigoth Christians of the 7th century created the converso or crypto-Jew problem. Over the centuries, as the church grew stronger and the Spanish reconquest or reconquista continued, Jewish repression and persecution increased. This is a list of major pogroms in Spain. And with each pogrom, more Jews converted or left Spain. The 1066 pogrom was the only pogrom that happened under Muslim rule. All the others were under Christian rule. Around 1300, there were about 120 Jewish communities in Catholic Spain with around 500,000 Jews. Then in the mid-1300s, the bubonic plague or Black Death hit Europe. Jews were blamed, and entire communities, including in Iberia, were destroyed. The beginning of the end for Spanish Jews occurred in 1391, with extensive waves of killings and assaults throughout the entire Iberian Peninsula, which destroyed entire Jewish communities. Jews converted by the tens of thousands, including prominent rabbis. Only 10% of the Jews of Valencia escaped death or conversion. And the chief rabbi of Burgos converted and became the archbishop of the city. Recall the map of Muslim Spain in the 8th century. Almost all of Spain was Muslim except for a slice of land in the north of Spain. But by 1391, all Spain was Christian, with the exception of Granada, which is that small brown slice in the very south of Spain. And the arrows on the map show how the riots spread across Spain. The 1391 riots had a profound effect on the Jewish community. Next video, please.
And so the effects of 1391 in some sense cannot be underestimated. It's believed that somewhere between 50,000 to 100,000 Jews were slain, composing every stratum of society in scores of towns and cities throughout the Spanish kingdoms. Most significantly, however, tens of thousands of Jews submitted to baptism in order to save their lives and those of their children. And this really exacerbated the question as to the religiosity or identity of these new Christians. It swelled their ranks, which of course would lead to future future events. And afterwards, I think after 1391, it can truly be said, as at least the historian David Nirenberg has, that Spanish Jewry
was a shell of its former self. Many Jews emigrated to North Africa, Morocco, and Algiers. And it is from these riots in 1391 that we get the bulk of conversos in Iberia. The church's hatred against the Jews became more pronounced, and Spanish Jews were compelled to wear a yellow badge on their clothes to distinguish themselves from Christians, and they were compelled to live in isolated neighborhoods or judarias, so they could not interact with Christians. After the bloody riots of 1391, new anti-Jewish laws were passed to further reduce the Jews to poverty, limit their occupations, and humiliate them in hopes of mass conversions. Jews could no longer bake matzah, study Talmud, or build new synagogues. In 1469, the Catholic monarchs, Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon, married and united their Spanish kingdoms. In 1490, 2 years before the expulsion, these rulers promised the Jews of Granada, the last surviving Muslim kingdom in southern Iberia, that if they aided the Spaniards in conquering Granada, they could continue to practice their religion. 2 years later, this promise was broken by the decree of expulsion. Now we turn to discuss conversos, but first, let's define who they are.
Because let's just understand, who are these people, these so-called new Christians? That's the term I've been using. So perhaps the most neutral term we can use is converso, which means converts, right? That's a term, whether they converted willingly, whether they converted against their will, it doesn't matter. They have converted to Christianity from Judaism. Christians called them new Christians in order to make a distinction, which does not exist theologically, between those people who were originally Jewish and now have become Christian with those who were originally Christian. And the new Christians were subject to a whole series of demeaning tests of faith to demonstrate what we would call in Latin the term bona fides, right? Maybe you've heard bona fide, as that's how Americans say it, right? Bona fides means good faith, meaning that they are, in fact, what they purport to be. The new Christians were not assumed to have bona fides. They were untrustworthy. The Hebrew term used is anusim, which means literally those who are forced. In other contexts, for example, that's the term used for someone who is raped, anus. The term marano is a derogatory term, means literally pigs. Obviously, this is used inappropriately. And finally, another neutral term, crypto-Jews. That is, they're still Jewish in secret, crypto-Jews. These are all the same people, but it gives you a sense of the various ways in which they could be viewed from without.
Let's discuss the converso problem further.
So imagine for yourself, you're a family that has been forcibly converted. It was either be baptized or be killed, and that's what was happening in 1391 in the riots. And now what do? The riots are gone, peace is restored, and do you just go back to living Jewishly, or are you going to be a target of another attack by Faray? So you try to maintain your lifestyle nominally as Christian, but you don't want to eat bread on Pesach, and you want to know when to fast on Yom Kippur, so you go back and you check in with your Jewish relatives and your Jewish compatriots, what exactly is going on Jewishly. If this goes on for a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, as it did, then it gets harder and harder because people are living more and more openly as Christians, and they have to, with some subterfuge, go back to the Jewish community. So what they started doing at this time was they started distinguishing these new Christians, we're going to explore the terminology shortly, and preventing them from having contact with Jews, because they knew that they're going to be, so to speak, infecting them with Jewish education, which is perhaps the worst thing that can happen in this case.
So conversos had a spectrum of religious identities. Some conversos embraced Christianity wholeheartedly. Others couldn't wait to be Jewish again, and there were lots of in-betweens. And Jews called conversos anusim, those who were forced to convert. The church did not condone forced conversions. But according to church doctrine, once a person has been baptized and become a Christian, even though they were forced to convert under penalty of death, they cannot legally go back to Judaism. That would be heresy, punishable by death. Being a Christian in a Christian majority culture had many benefits. Jews were urban, literate, could do numbers, had great trading skills and a worldwide trading network. Once they converted to Christianity, the laws that kept them down no longer applied, and they rose in society quickly in all fields, including the economy, the government, and the church. These people were called new Christians and were resented by old Christians. Spanish nobles who traced their Christian lineage back to the Visigoth era now regretted having urged Jews to convert, because now these new Christians had risen high in society and threatened the old Christians whose families have been Catholic for centuries. So now the anger and resentment that had been directed at Jews was now directed at new Christians. In 1449, riots against new Christians broke out in Toledo. And as a result of these riots, new laws of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood, were passed. You now had to prove your pedigree going back generations to show that you were a real Christian without Jewish or Muslim ancestors. Otherwise, you could be barred from the army, the university, and most professions. Consistent with Visigoth laws, this was racial anti-Semitism, because even converting to Christianity does not save you. Thus began a centuries-long Spanish Christian obsession with race, purity, and lineage. All conversos, whether sincere or not, were considered Jews by their neighbors and discriminated against. For new Christians, there was constant fear of finding an ancestor who had Jewish blood, which could result in a person's entire family line losing everything as a result. So new Christians hid or destroyed all evidence of their Jewish or Muslim background. And this began a black market for forged documents for new Christians wanting to clean up their backgrounds. By the mid-1400s, 1/3 of Spanish Jews had been forcibly converted, 1/3 had been martyred, and 1/3 remained Jewish. And this broke the back of the largest and most cultured Jewish community in the world. Now we turn to the Inquisition. The Spanish state became obsessed with crypto-Jews and heresy. Church and state acted as one, and heresy against the church became treason against the state. In 1478, the Pope established the Inquisition to ferret out heresy. 2 years later, in 1480, the first Spanish inquisitor was appointed by Ferdinand and Isabella. In 1483, Tomas Torquemada, an evil man, was appointed Inquisitor General. By the time of Torquemada's death in 1498, 2,000 people had already been executed and thousands had their property taken. Although the Pope created the Inquisition, it was not under papal control. The Inquisition made its own rules and answered only to the Spanish crown.
Unfortunately for the conversos, the Inquisition proved to be absolutely horrific and deadly. I won't go into great detail about this because we have spoken about it in several other classes. But let us recall that the Inquisition was originally directed not at the Jews who remained Jewish, because they were not considered heretics. They were not considered backsliding Christians. They were just non-Christians, and they fell within the doctrine of witness. But once a Jew was baptized, that was it. There's no going back. And so any Jew who consorted, any converso who consorted with Jews would be subject to the dictates of the Inquisition. We shall see a little bit about how this operated in terms of the belief system of the crypto-Jews. But let us recall that what would happen is the conversos would be accused by a neighbor, let's say, who saw them, let's say, lighting candles on Friday night, perhaps placing them under clay pots or something like that. And then that would be reported to the Inquisition. The person would be brought in. There would be horrific tortures. After the tortures, they would typically betray so many other people they knew who did the same thing. They would be brought in. The Inquisition was paid for by confiscations from those accused and later killed by the Inquisition, so it proved to be quite in the interest of the Inquisition to accuse as many people as possible. And informants were also rewarded for their services, and therefore if you liked your neighbor's cow, chances are an easy way to get it would be simply say that, you know, they typically slaughter their cows moving left to right with a knife and things like that. So it's a terrifying kind of social phenomenon.
Here is another description of Inquisition procedure.
What would happen is that these conversos who were suspected of Judaizing would be drawn before the Inquisition and, as I mentioned, tortured. They'd be required to confess and name names. And then they would be sentenced, as in this famous representation by de Goya, to a series of ritual abasements that were designed to serve as markers to the larger population of the dangers of Judaizing, and also as fitting punishments for the conversos themselves. They would often be required to wear this humiliating tunic and the conical dunce cap. The tunic was called the San Benito. You can see them here in these pictures. They're clearly very dejected. In some cases, they were required to wear it for life. In other cases, they were required to endure various torments, including the death penalty, the auto da fe, the being burned at the stake.
Here is a San Benito robe in the Jewish Museum of Cordoba. Next video, please.
After Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, some Jews stayed in hiding and were arrested by the Inquisition. This San Benito was an Inquisition cape which convicted Judaizers were forced to wear as a sign of shame. This particular San Benito was for Gonzalo el Rubio, convicted of Judaizing in 1510.
The flames at the bottom of this San Benito robe signify that the ultimate fate of this person was to be burnt by flames. And after the burning, the robe itself will be hung up on the wall of their parish church so that all of the person's family and descendants would forever be tainted by their sin of Judaizing. Here is a painting of an auto de fe, an act of faith, before burning in Madrid in 1680. It was a big spectacle with king and queen and nobles and clergy and dignitaries and lay people all attending. In the very center, we see two very small figures wearing dunce hats who are the accused. Let's look at how the Inquisition worked. Next slide, please. These were some of the procedures. First, a person was presumed to be guilty upon arrest, the opposite of what we say. The proceedings were strictly secret. They were not informed of the charges. They didn't know their accusers. They didn't know the witnesses. All testimony was acceptable, even hearsay. If you made a confession under torture and retracted it, it didn't matter. It still could be used. You had an advocate, but it wasn't a lawyer for you. It was an advocate to help you confess. You had no recourse to any court of appeal, and the instruments of torture were helpful in inducing the crucial confession of heresy. This is a photo taken in the modern archives of the Spanish Inquisition. The large bundle to the right of this man's head is the inquisitorial record of one person or case or family. The Inquisition kept meticulous records of its proceedings, and this is similar to the detailed records of the Holocaust kept by Nazi Germany several centuries later. Despite all the laws against Jews and Judaizers, and despite the brutal Inquisition, there continued to be a large population of crypto-Jews who practiced Judaism secretly. So the task of rooting out heresy in Spain proved impossible. And Torquemada and the Spanish monarchs came up with a plan to solve the problem. If they expelled all Jews from Spain, then there would be no more Jews left to influence or teach the crypto Jews, and Judaism would eventually disappear from the Iberian Peninsula. So in 1492, the decision was made to expel all Jews from Spain. And that is where our story will continue next week, along with a description of the imprint left by Sephardic Jews around the world. Thank you.
One cannot help but think in that position what we would do. Would we continue our heritage? Would we convert? Would we marry other crypto Jews? What would we do? It is so incredible that here we are studying this and that there still is a Jewish presence after all these years, and that there are crypto Jews still in Mexico and in the Southwest who are just returning to Judaism after they have discovered through DNA that in fact they come from a line of Jews. I see Lisa's hand.
Yeah, I don't know if at the beginning of the course you asked if anybody is of Sephardic ancestry, but my father's family, he is a totus, and according to our family lore, you know, the Chief Justice of the Rabbinical Court in Cordoba, Spain, in 1492 was a totus, and they left, they stayed Jewish, you know, they didn't convert, and they left and went to, I think, you know, what turned out to be like Latvia and Estonia. And they were actually helped by a Protestant minister when they went over there. But that's where my family, part of my family was from. And before that, they could trace them back to the chief, the chief rabbi of Rome in 70 AD was a totus. So, you know, my ancestors were in high places, but always they were in high places at the wrong time, right? 70 AD is when they destroyed the Second Temple, and then 1492 was the Inquisition and the expulsion. So, yeah, but it's interesting.
And here you are.
Yeah, here I am. Just thought I'd share, but I don't know if anybody else can actually say that, you know, taking this class, if that's in their family history. I don't know. Has anybody said anything?
Not yet.
Oh, okay.
They're all crypto Jews here. Linda.
Are we going to talk later in the class about the book, The Mezuzah at the Foot of the Madonna, and in New Mexico, the churches there that have Mogen Davids in the corners?
Yes, the third class next week.
Okay.
I start off with the expulsion and take us through the voyages of the Sephardic community through the world, into the New World, into America, into Mexico. Yes, into Mexico.
Wonderful. I just can't get
fascinating.
over the fact that at some points in our history, it was a death sentence to carry on our tradition. And we need to think about that now, where we have the freedom to worship and study and practice as Jews, and that some people walk away from it with this freedom. And that everyone should take this course, and then I think they would treasure their freedom more to embrace our Jewish heritage. I saw Anita's hand.
You have a question about what happened to the economies of all these countries that kicked out their Jews.
I'll talk about that later, but any country that expels its doctors, its lawyers, its philosophers, its artists, its goldsmiths, its silversmiths, its diplomats, its bureaucrats, has to go down. And this is what happened in Spain after the expulsion. Spain was an unusual situation because it was saved by all of the gold and jewels coming in from the New World. But every other country that has expelled its Jews went downhill after that.
I just want to say one last thing. I know we're at our time, but the idea of Jewish literacy played a big part in those centuries where we lived in Spain, because the Jews were intermediaries between the monks, the Christians who were literate and spoke Latin and wrote Latin, and the Muslims who spoke and wrote Arabic. And the Jews were the translators, and they were literate in all of those languages. Thank you so much. I think we're all
Thank you.
churning with the
We'll
knowledge.
see everybody next week.